All right, let's talk about Sparta. When you think of Sparta, you probably picture unbreakable warriors, right? This image of pure military might. But what if I told you that whole image was basically a mirage, a carefully built wall designed to hide a fatal flaw at its very core? Today, we're digging into the Great Helot Revolt, an event that didn't just shake Sparta, it cracked its foundations wide open for everyone to see.
So let's just jump right in. What was Sparta's greatest weakness? We always hear about their legendary army, their unmatched hoplites. But their biggest threat wasn't some foreign army they could meet on the field of battle. Nope, it was a danger that was living right there with them, one they had to face every single day.
And that threat? It was the Helots. Now, it's so important to understand, these weren't just slaves in the way we might think of them. They were an entire conquered people, the Messenians, who had a living memory of freedom. They did all the work, they ran the economy, they were the engine of the entire Spartan state. And because of that, they were also the source of Sparta's deepest, most persistent paranoia. I mean, just look at this number. For every one full Spartan citizen, there were about 7 Helots. 7 to 1. Can you imagine living in a society where you are that dramatically outnumbered by a captive population that, let's be honest, has every reason to absolutely despise you? That single terrifying fact shaped everything about what it meant to be Spartan.
And don't just take my word for it. The great historian Thucydides, our best source for this period, he tells us that the fear of a Helot uprising wasn't just a concern for Sparta. It was, and I quote, the paramount concern of Spartan policy. Everything they did, from their brutal training to their foreign policy, was all about keeping the Helots under control.
So you've got this constant simmering tension just below the surface, a real powder keg, and all it needed was a spark to just explode into open warfare. Well, that spark came, quite literally, from the earth itself.
Around 464 BC, a massive earthquake just flattens the city of Sparta. And in that moment of pure chaos, the Helots saw their chance. They rose up, they grabbed weapons, they seized the nearby mountain fortress of Itami, and they kicked off a brutal 10-year-long war. And here's the spoiler. It doesn't end in some glorious Spartan victory. It ends in a humiliating truce.
Now, some of the later sources paint this absolutely terrifying picture of the earthquake. Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries after the fact, claims that more than 20,000 Lacedaemonians, that's another name for the Spartans, were killed in the disaster, a staggering number.
But hold on. As good historians, we can't just take a number like that at face value, right? The drama is great, but we have to ask the critical question. Is this reliable information, or is this just a little bit of historical exaggeration?
And this is where things get really interesting. See, Diodorus and Plutarch, they're writing 500 years later. They're telling a great story. But our best source, Thucydides, who is writing so much closer to the event, he mentions the earthquake, sure, but he gives no death toll at all. And that silence, you guys, that silence speaks volumes. It tells us we should be really, really skeptical of that 20,000 figure.
Okay, so in the middle of all this chaos, buildings are down, people are trapped, the entire Spartan state is on the verge of just collapsing. And in that moment, Spartan leadership was put to the ultimate test.
According to Plutarch, King Archidamos had this incredible moment of clarity. He realized the real danger wasn't the earthquake itself, it was the Helots, who would be coming for them any minute. So instead of ordering people to rescue survivors, he ordered the trumpeter to sound the signal for an enemy attack. It was genius. It rallied the dazed Spartans into a fighting formation, and it probably saved them from being massacred on the spot. But here's the twist, right? This incredible act of leadership actually shines a giant spotlight on the system's profound failure. Think about it. A king shouldn't have to save his city from its own workforce. The fact that he had to, the fact that this was the immediate threat, well, that tells you everything you need to know about how deeply broken Spartan society really was.
So the rebels dig in on Mount Ithome, and the Spartans, who are masters of open field battle, suddenly find themselves completely stuck. They had no idea how to attack a fortified position, so they had to do something unthinkable. They had to ask for help from their great rivals, the Athenians.
And Thucydides gives us this absolutely remarkable admission. He says Sparta, the greatest land power in all of Greece, was, his words, clearly deficient when it came to siege warfare. They had to call Athens specifically because the Athenians were the experts. It was a public, humiliating admission of a massive hole in their military capability. But then, that famous Spartan paranoia kicks in. They start looking at the democratic Athenians with their clever ideas and their talk of freedom, and they get terrified. What if the Athenians get inspired by the Helots' cause and switch sides? So, in a move that is just pure diplomatic madness, they dismiss the entire Athenian army. They just send their allies home with no explanation.
The fallout from this was, well, it was catastrophic. The Athenians were insulted, humiliated. The Grand Alliance that had literally just saved Greece from the Persian Empire shattered instantly. Athens turns right around and makes new alliances with Sparta's traditional enemies. The two most powerful states in Greece were now on a collision course, and the road to the Peloponnesian War was wide open.
So after a decade of fighting, a decade of crisis, what's the final verdict here? How did Sparta do? Let's weigh the failures. You can really see it as a failure on two fronts. On the one hand, a military failure. A 10-year siege in their own backyard that they couldn't win. It exposed them as one-trick ponies. But then you have the diplomatic failure. They were so arrogant and paranoid that they insulted a major ally and turned them into a mortal enemy.
And let's be crystal clear. Sparta did not win this war. After a decade of trying, they couldn't crush the rebellion. They had to cut a deal. They agreed to let the rebels walk away, totally free, as long as they left the region. For all their pride, they basically had to pay their enemies to just go away.
So this whole mess really just rips the curtain back on Sparta's deep, structural weaknesses. It showed a state that was so specialized in one kind of warfare it was inflexible. It showed a state totally dependent on a massive population that hated its guts. And it showed a state so diplomatically arrogant it couldn't trust anyone, not even its allies. Which leaves us with a final question to think about. We know the Helot Revolt was a massive Spartan failure, but which part of that failure was actually more damaging in the long run? Was it the military weakness that forced them to ask for help? Or was it the political arrogance that blew up an alliance and paved the way for a century of war? It's a tough call,